way the American diet has evolved over the past couple of decades has led to too many people eating the foods which are blatantly wrong for them. And the reason this is happening is because of the way commercialism, consumerism, big food companies are playing with our minds to get us to give our money to entities so that short-term shareholder value can go up at the expense of quality foods entering our body. If you aren't actively and consciously aware of what to eat, how to combine the right foods, you're going to be performing at below normal levels of cognitive functioning. You're more likely to experience early onset of brain disease like Alzheimer's, and you're more likely to get sick. And Max is going to teach you how to be conscious of what you put in your body so that your brain, your body are operating at peak levels. Max, welcome on set.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here, Vishen.
So before we begin, I just want to tell people about your bio because Max's story is pretty incredible. So Max used to run an incredible television show called Current TV. It was a network set up by Al Gore, and you hosted, I think you wrote and scripted some 200 episodes on Current TV, including with our mutual friend, Jason Silva.
Yes.
In fact, you and Jason had a television show called Max and Jason, but everything in your life changed when your mom was diagnosed with early onset of Alzheimer's.
Yeah, she had this really strange form of dementia, and I had no prior family history of any kind of neurological condition. So, we all in my family have a little bit of ADD, but beyond that, the word dementia was not in my lexicon.
And we're going to come to that story in a moment, but that led you to go on this journey to try to understand what was going on with your mom's brain. So Max used his background as a journalist to get access to some of the best minds in health, and he went deep. Today, Max has appeared on Dr. Oz pretty much more so than any typical guest. You have spoken at South by Southwest, the New York Academy of Science, Biohacker Summit in Stockholm, and you have a top 10 iTunes health podcast called The Genius Life. And most of all, you have written an incredible book called Genius Foods, which I'd love for you guys to check out because this book is just a really incredible how-to guide. Now, Max, there was something about this book in your opening chapter about your mom that really touched me. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so I was coming out of that stint at Current TV. I had done that for 6 years, and when you're beholden to the programming schedule of a daily show, you're not really allowed to stray too far from the studio, essentially. And I was living in Los Angeles for a long time, and my mom lived back home in New York City, which is where I'm from. And once my job at Current TV ended, I began spending more and more time with her in New York City because, I'm sort of the oldest child in the family. Me and my mom have a very, very close relationship. And I would notice that it seemed as if her brain's processing speed had downshifted. My mom is a very fast-walking, fast-talking New Yorker. If she were our age, she would be, somebody that we would call a high performer, an entrepreneurial spirit. She had a business that she ran with my dad. She was always the life of any party and any room that she was in, ultimately. But it seemed as if suddenly she had almost had a brain transplant with a much older person. And that sounds really kind of crazy, a little bit science fiction-y, but it's true. I had noticed that, when I was in the kitchen with my mom cooking food together on some of those trips that I would take back home, that I would ask her to pass something, like a spice, for example, that she was next to, and it would take her an extra beat to hand me that spice. It would be quicker for me to traverse the kitchen and grab it from her. And we kind of expect a slower reaction time in somebody who's much older, like an elder person, but not in somebody who's in their late 50s. That's still young. But I ultimately kind of chalked it up to normal aging. I didn't think much of it until one weekend my entire family was in Miami with my dad. Now, my parents have been divorced since I was 18, but this was one of the few occasions where we would all annually get together, and my mom and dad have an amicable relationship, so we would stay at my dad's house. And I just remember so distinctly, we were all in the living room, and my dad was sitting on the couch, and my mom was across the breakfast bar. The living room and the dining room were connected. through this marble stretch, and in front of the whole family, she announced formally that she had been having memory problems, and that she had recently sought the help of a neurologist. And again, me and my family, there was no precedent for this. So to say that we were ignorant of my mom's complaints is an understatement. My dad, who's always had a sardonic sense of humor, chuckled and said, "Come on, if you're having memory problems, prove it. What year is it?" And my mom couldn't recall the year.
She couldn't recall the year you guys were in.
She couldn't recall the year. And I know that sounds crazy.
And this was someone who was in her 50s.
This is someone who's in her 50s. And I mean, since then, it's gotten worse and worse. But in that moment, me and my brothers were in such disbelief that we chimed in, patronizing her in a way because we were so stupid. We were so ignorant. We had no idea what was bubbling underneath the surface of my mom's brain. And we said, "Come on, Mom, how can you not know what year it was?" And she began to cry. And that, for me, was the moment that everything changed. I knew that I had to really step in, that I had the ability to because of my sort of atypical career. I had a lot of free time at the moment. I was in between jobs. And I began going with my mom to doctor's appointments to really get a sense of what was going on. She didn't know. She just knew that she was having these subjective, strange symptoms. And ultimately, our journey took us to the Cleveland Clinic, which is considered one of the cathedrals to Western medicine. It's known for taking on very complex medical cases. And it was there that for the first time, my mom was diagnosed with a neurodegenerative disease. She was prescribed drugs for both Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. And that was when, for me, that was the line drawn in the sand, where from that point forward, I became unable to think about my previous life in Hollywood. Right. It was I'm sure you talk a lot about like the singularity and its implications. Well, the singularity is like a term for which there's a demarcation, in terms of the way things were and the way that things are going to be. And it was a personal singularity for me in the sense that I basically was unable to think about anything other than what might have contributed to my mom developing this condition, and simultaneously what there was that I could do, if anything, to prevent it from ever happening to myself and others that I care about.
Now, what are the odds of someone developing Alzheimer's as they get older?
Terrifying. If you make it to the age of 85, you have a 50% chance.
50%?
Yeah, 50% chance of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
Wow, and most of us are going to live to be 80 to 90 to 100.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the Stanford Center on Longevity predicts that the millennial generation, we're the first generation that on average is going to live to the age of 90. And so what that means is if you're a millennial watching this, you have a coin toss odds of developing Alzheimer's disease, which is a condition for which there is no meaningful treatment. I mean, millennials, I think, we're defined by a trust in science and technology. It's sort of like our secular religion, you might argue. But Alzheimer's drug trials have a 99.6% fail rate. So there's not really a cure in sight. And the treatments that are currently available and FDA approved are minimally effective, if at all. And so this is a real, I think, call to do what we can do to prevent this from ever happening to us. I mean, the other thing about millennials is that we've invested more in human capital than any previous generation. So think about what a loss of intelligence that's going to be if half of millennials.
True. That is a jaw-dropping statistic. And one of the reasons why I felt this particular training was so important is because, heck, I'm going to be mid-50s in 12 years.
You look good for your age.
Thank you.
By the way.
Thank you. But I don't want that happening to me. And I know that in your book you said something that woke me up. I believe, and I may be quoting this wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, but after the age of 40, and I'm 42, after the age of 40, I believe you said that the average person will lose 1 to 2% of their brain matter every year.
Yeah.
Right? And what we're eating isn't helping. So what can we do to prevent this? Like, is this preventable? Can we reduce the odds of developing early onset of diseases like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's?
So there's a debate going on in medicine as to whether or not we can truly and should truly be able to use the word prevention when talking about these conditions, or whether or not it is a risk minimization strategy, minimizing your risk. To me, I think that we can use the word prevention because we use it for other conditions. We talk about cardiovascular disease prevention, right? We talk about cancer prevention, and the steps that we can take to reduce our risk for cancer. You can do everything right and still succumb to any of these conditions. There might be a genetic mutation that we have yet to discover that's going to flip the switch for you. We don't yet have all the answers. But what we do know is that the way that we're living today is the tide that's rising all the boats on chronic, non-communicable diseases that are now burdening pretty much every economy around the world. I mean, obesity, type 2 diabetes,
Right.
These are quickly becoming the United States' top exports. And when it comes to Alzheimer's disease is the incidence of Alzheimer's disease is rising part and parcel with all of the other chronic conditions that we're seeing burdening our world.
So what you're saying is, as the American diet is spreading across the world, obesity is going up, but also what's rising is the incidence of Alzheimer's and
Yes.
other brain-related diseases, which points to the fact that a lot of this could be happening because of what we put in our bodies.
Yes, absolutely. I interviewed Suzanne de la Monte, who is one of the top neuropathologists studying this field. She actually coined the term type 3 diabetes to describe Alzheimer's disease. I mean, think about that for a second. Type 3 diabetes as a sort of hint as to what might contribute to the etiology of Alzheimer's disease. But Suzanne de la Monte also has a master's in public health, and I interviewed her about Alzheimer's disease statistics. And the fact that we're living longer isn't enough to explain the fact that more and more people are developing Alzheimer's disease, because rates of Alzheimer's disease, incidence of Alzheimer's disease, are increasing among every age demographic. 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds,
Wow.
80-year-olds. The rates of Alzheimer's disease are increasing. So the aging population is not enough to explain the fact that we're all increasingly becoming more and more demented.
So you suspect it's the food.
I think food has a major role to play, absolutely.
And I want to point something out here. So maybe if you're watching this, you might be in your mid-30s. How old are you, Max?
I'm 36.
You're 36, right? So maybe you're in your mid-30s, maybe you're in your mid-20s, and you're thinking, that is still like decades away from me. I don't have to worry about it. Well, what I want to point out is that what we're going to be talking about here today, as Max writes about in this book, is not just about the food you should eat to prevent Alzheimer's, but the food you should eat to basically create better brain health. And what we're talking about is, so I'm going to quote something from your book, Max. You said that when participants start cutting out certain foods, even rates of depression go down, rates of cognitive functioning go up. So let's go there. Because what I want to do is I want to make sure that people who are watching this are not thinking, that's not me.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
This is too far away from me. This is something I worry about for my parents, but too far away from me. What do we need to do right now to ensure that our brains are healthier, that our cognitive functioning is at its peak level, that rates of depression go down? What do we need to know about the connection between food and our brain?
Well, first of all, if you're watching this at home, no matter what age you are, you have to understand that dementia, in most cases, and especially when it comes to Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, begins in the brain decades before the first symptom. So this is not an old person's condition. This is Alzheimer's disease begins in the brain 20, 30, maybe even 40 years or earlier before the first symptom.
Wow.
Yeah, they've got biomarkers that are associated with Alzheimer's disease that they've seen on PET scans in the brains of people as young as 20. And air pollution, they've looked at the what air pollution does to the brain in cities like Mexico City that are very heavily polluted. And they find that brain pathology is not something that is exclusive to old people. But here's the value add of this discussion and Genius Foods and all of the work really that I've dedicated my life to, is that the same things that are going to help procure a cognitively healthier tomorrow and help shield you against these kinds of conditions also make your brain work better in the here and now.
In the here and now, yes. And I want to state, pay attention to this, folks, because think about it this way, right? In previous discussions here on our program, you've heard me share some statistics. For example, one interesting stat that has changed the way I live my day-to-day life is understanding that when I cut back on sleep, my cognition goes down. In fact, according to Tom Rath, if you eliminate 90 minutes of required sleep, your cognition goes down as much as 30%. Now, knowing that ensures that I never skip a good night's sleep, because I don't want to go to work the next day with my brain not at its optimal self, right? Now, the same thing applies to food. What you're going to learn here is what foods you need to start putting in your body so your cognition, your ability to generate ideas, to think, to remember facts increases. And think about what this is going to do for your career, for your work. If you're working in a technical field or if you run your own business, your decision-making ability is what gives you power. It what helps you grow your business. If that is being depreciated because you're putting crap in your body, this is going to be not just a health hit, but a financial hit for you. So what do we need to do?
So I like to make it really easy for people, and you know, I feel like people these days have been beaten over the head with the fact that sugar is not good. I go into detail on why sugar is not good in my book, but I think I also really like to make it easy for people and practical and say, look, these are the foods that you should be eating, right? And I think one of the reasons why I do that is that our diets have changed dramatically over the past 10,000 years. Mm-hmm. We ate for a certain way for millions of years, but certainly the last 200,000 years that we've been anatomically modern humans that led to the evolution and the development of the supercomputer that everybody watching this is heir to. I call it the flagship product of Darwinian evolution. I mean, this is an incredible legacy, a torch that you carry with you every single day. And yet for most people, you know, there's a statistic that 1 in 7 younger people, their brains are not working the way that they ought to.
1 in 7?
1 in 7 younger people, yeah. Between the ages of 18 and 39. So this is a terrifying statistic, and I think that the reason for that is about 10,000 years ago we changed our diets and we started adopting foods that were very nutrient poor and energy dense, and this paved the way. The agricultural revolution is what that turning point really was. It paved the way for the fact that today 60% of the calories that we consume come not only from ultra processed foods, but processed foods made from 3 plants: wheat, corn, and rice. Again, these foods are energy dense but nutrient poor. So the foods that I recommend for people to consume and to really buy on loop essentially in the supermarket are foods that are nutrient dense, okay? Foods that are basically going to give your brains the building blocks that it needs to fend off from the stresses and insults thrown at it at every turn by the modern world, but then also the antioxidants that's going to help it, you know, again, defend itself, and the building blocks that it's going to use to create healthy new brain cells for the rest of your life.
So what you're saying, and I recall this from the book, 60% of what we eat right now is corn, wheat, and rice.
Yeah.
Right? And you're saying that we shouldn't be doing this.
Right.
Because it's these are foods which are nutrient sparse.
Well, it's one of the reasons why, and you alluded to this, that we are overfed and undernourished. I mean, we are living right now, for the first time in human history, there are more overweight people walking the earth than underweight.
That's crazy.
And yet, malnutrition runs rampant in the first world.
Now, these 3 foods, are these foods that you suggest we avoid completely, we eat in moderation? Like, what is a healthy ratio?
Yeah, I mean, I try to avoid them, and I recommend that people avoid, definitely I recommend that people avoid packaged processed foods. But when it comes to concentrated sources of carbohydrates, like wheat, corn, rice, things like that, you know, 50% of the people in the United States, and increasingly around the world, this is a ratio that is mirrored everywhere you look these days. You get off any plane at any airport, and you see people that are that reflect a characteristic called diabesity. And this is essentially describes the fact that 50% of people are either diabetic or pre-diabetic, and 66% of people today are either overweight or obese. So for that, because most of the people in the world now look like that, I don't recommend consuming grains like wheat, corn, and rice. On the other hand, and this is
so are you saying cut them out completely? What about like rice in moderation?
Well,
or bread in moderation.
The safest time to eat those foods is after a vigorous workout, which I recommend to everybody. But the truth is, most people are more sedentary than ever.
So you're saying we don't need these foods at all?
We don't need them at all.
Okay.
Because really, we have limited real estate on our plates and in our stomachs, right? And so the foods that I want people to really focus on, if you're watching this, are foods that embody the characteristic of nutrient density. Wheat, corn, and rice are not nutrient-dense foods. On the other hand, nutrient-dense foods are eggs, grass-fed red meat, poultry, dark chocolate. Hey,
right.
Everybody loves dark
book,
chocolate.
You said there was a study you quoted in your book about people who eat dark chocolate once a week.
Yeah, tend to have better memory function.
Wow.
Yeah, cacao is actually a fruit. That doesn't
news.
mean that you're eating fruit when you're eating a chocolate bar, but when you eat dark chocolate, it's one of the most polyphenol-dense food sources that exist. And polyphenols actually have a really unique ability. It could almost be said that polyphenols give your cells a workout at the cellular level. And chocolate is also one of the top sources that we have of magnesium, which we know 50% of people are not consuming enough of. Magnesium is a really important mineral. It's called a macro mineral, which means that it's called that because we need to get a relatively large amount of it every single day. 50% of us are not doing that. And magnesium is critically important for 300 at least enzymatic processes in the body that range from energy creation in the brain to mopping up DNA repair.
That's incredible news, guys. Eat dark chocolate. Wow. Okay, so those were four. What could you list the first four again?
Yeah, so grass-fed beef.
Okay, grass-fed beef, understood.
Yeah.
What about people who don't eat beef, like people, like many people in India?
Yeah.
Is there a substitute meat?
Seafood. Seafood is certainly
Seafood.
great. You don't have to eat red meat, but it is a very nutrient-dense food. Seafood
In your
is-
book, you mentioned salmon.
Yes. Fatty fish, wild salmon is incredible.
Now,
Sardines.
What was number two?
Number two, well, eggs.
Eggs. And you mentioned something interesting in the book, which is not to eat hard-boiled eggs. Can you explain why?
Yeah, well, if you have a hard-boiled egg every now and then, it's not the end of the world. But what's so incredibly special about egg yolks, when an embryo is developing, the first structure to really assemble is the nervous system, which includes the brain. The brain makes up the central nervous system, right? And so an egg yolk is literally nature's multivitamin, but specifically formulated to help nurture the developing brain. And in, part and parcel for growing a brain, it's full of fat. And in particular, very delicate fats called polyunsaturated fatty acids and, of course, cholesterol. I know that we're going to talk about cholesterol in a little bit, but it's important to realize that 25% of the body's cholesterol is found in the brain. That's one of the reasons why an egg yolk is so rich in cholesterol.
It's good brain food.
Yeah, it's good brain food. It's not there by accident. Now, we don't need to eat cholesterol for our brains because our brains actually produce all the cholesterol it needs. But an egg yolk contains literally a little bit of everything else required for healthy brain function. And so going back to the hard-boiled question, high heat can degrade fats. Now, luckily, in an egg yolk, those fats are also protected by antioxidants, which are found in that egg yolk. But nonetheless, I think subjecting fats, especially delicate polyunsaturated fats and cholesterol, to high temperature cooking is not a smart idea for long-term health.
Got it. And now what was number three before you went on to chocolate?
I might have mentioned. Well, we can go through them. It's grass-fed beef, fatty fish, dark chocolate, extra virgin olive oil, eggs. We've got cruciferous vegetables, dark leafy greens, berries.
Like blueberries. You specifically mentioned blueberries in your book.
Well, yes. So all berries have unique and distinct benefits. But in the case of blueberries are rich in a pigment category called anthocyanins. And anthocyanins have actually been found to be particularly beneficial to the brain. They've actually been found to accumulate in the brain's memory center, the hippocampus, where they work to help shield it against aging and also make it perform better. They did an interesting population level study where they found that people who consumed had the highest degree of berry consumption had brains that performed about 2.5 years younger.
I am so glad I like blueberries.
Yeah, they're great. They're tremendous.
Now, what was number six? Did you say crispy leaf vegetables?
Dark leafy greens, yes.
Dark leafy greens,
Yeah.
okay.
So going back to nutrient density is a term that basically describes a ratio. And when you have a high ratio of nutrients to calories, that's the hallmark of nutrient density. And there's no better example of a nutrient-dense food than dark leafy greens, which are packed with nutrients and yet contain very few calories.
And in the book, you recommend that one of the foods which have the highest correlation with brain health is dark leafy greens.
Yes.
And you mentioned to take around 2 servings a day.
Yes.
Right now, define what goes into dark leafy greens. What exactly is that category?
So my favorites, kale, spinach, and arugula. They both have distinct benefits to them, but I like that blend. Kale is probably the most nutrient dense of all vegetables. Yeah, it's very good for you. Arugula I like in particular because arugula supplies nitrates, which actually have a vasodilation effect, can reduce blood pressure. And research has suggested that all it takes is one single high nitrate meal to increase blood flow to the brain and boost working memory, which is what we all want. We all want to have better memory.
That's phenomenal. I eat spinach every single day.
Oh, that's awesome. Spinach is incredible. It's
what about the final two?
The final two, we have nuts. So nuts are, a superfood. They're very...
and in the book, you specifically focus on almonds.
Yeah, I've picked almonds out because not only do the skins of almonds provide a prebiotic effect, they help nurture the bacteria that live in our large intestines, but they're a top source of two things that make the brain really happy. One is vitamin E, which is a fat-soluble antioxidant, which helps protect the brain, which is made of fat, against oxidation. Now, oxidation is sort of like this, esoteric word for many people that we tend to think of abstractly, but to put in really simple terms, it's what happens when you slice an apple and you leave it out on the counter. It turns brown. It ages. And so that's what's happening in the brain. It's something that all living things have to contend with, but the brain in particular is a crucible for oxidation. And so fat-soluble antioxidants in particular help the brain fend off against oxidative stress. And the other thing that almonds have going for them is that it's a very rich source of magnesium, which we already talked about. Dark chocolate is a tremendous source, but just a handful of almonds provides about 25% of your daily recommended allowance for magnesium.
That's incredible. And I think the 10th food is avocados?
Yes. Yeah, so avocados are tremendous. They have the highest concentration of fat-protecting antioxidants of any fruit or vegetable. So they are abundant in vitamin E, again, but they also provide a number of compounds called carotenoids, like lutein and zeaxanthin. These carotenoids have been actually used in trials in college-age students. They gave a University of Georgia trial, supplemented college students with lutein and zeaxanthin, and they found that it actually boosted their visual processing speed.
What?
Which is incredible.
Wow.
Visual processing speed is when you take in a visual stimulus and you respond to it. So when it comes to playing video games, driving, sports, basically anything in the modern world that
So avocados do that, and carrots do that as well, right?
Well, carrots have another kind of carotenoid called beta carotene, which is a provitamin A, also very important. So carotenoids are sort of it's a category of foods.
So it's not a myth that carrots are good for the eyes.
It's not a myth at all, no, and it's also good. They're also good for the brain. But carrots are really
But
great.
we'll leave carrots aside; they're not on your list. But avocados are.
Avocados are tremendous. Yes, avocados are tremendous. They're also a rich source of fiber. A medium-sized avocado has about 12 grams of dietary fiber, which again feeds the bacteria that live in your gut. And they also have twice the potassium of a banana. A lot of people eat bananas thinking we need to get the potassium for our cardiovascular health, which is really important for brain health because what's good for the heart is good for the brain. But an avocado has a fraction of the glycemic load, meaning like the sugar in a banana, but it has twice the potassium. So that's
It's in every way a superfood, something you really want to pay attention to.
You get a lot of bang for your buck.
This is how I got myself eating healthy, right? I have my list of foods I want to focus on, and when I go to the grocery store to pick up my food, I focus on that list first. So I pick all of these important items and dump them in my cart, and it just becomes a habit. And now automatically when I go to the grocery store, I've been doing this for 2 years now, I just end up naturally picking the healthy items. And so I just made it part of my shopping habit.
Yeah, I mean, what you do, Vishen, is what the healthiest people in the world seem to do, especially those people that seem to embody health in the modern world, in the first world. They've done research at, I believe it was Tulane University, where they found that the advice to eat everything in moderation today really leads to the consumption of more confectionery products.
It's stupid advice.
It's very stupid advice.
Yeah, guys, please don't. That whole thing, eat everything in moderation, I want to stress, is some of the dumbest health advice out there. And it's why, as you said, the majority of people today on planet Earth are obese. Now, here's another tip, because I found that this really helped me. So I am a Netflix watcher. Like, I love coming home from work and just sitting in front of Netflix with my wife or my kids and just enjoying a good movie or TV show, right? And I used to eat chips. Now, what I've done is I've substituted that with nuts, with kale chips, which are super healthy, with blueberries, with avocado, almonds.
Yeah.
And so this does not mean that you cannot snack, but you can snack on the right things. And a lot of the foods that you mentioned, Max, are beautifully delicious snackable food. Dark chocolate, for example. That's the one. That's the one that my family loves snacking on when we watch a good movie. One more thing to avoid. Please avoid Coke, avoid cola. Like, do not even introduce that poison to your kids. I trained my kids from the time they were like 2 years old to dislike the taste of Coke, so they cannot even consume it right now. And I've trained myself, so a single sip of Coke makes me sick. Now, what you can do to substitute soda is get yourself used to sparkling water. I used to be hooked on Coke because I grew up in the developing world. And I remember that transition from the 80s to the 90s, when American cable television came into Malaysia. Coca-Cola, Sprite, all of these drinks became popular to the point where my grandmother would serve them to us for lunch, thinking that this was appropriate. This was what a middle-class family did, right? And not realizing how damaging these things were. So to get myself off Coke, I got myself hooked on sparkling water. Sparkling water became my substitute for every bad cola out there. And sparkling water is harmless, 0 calories. And within a week or so, you can get yourself to get used to the taste of sparkling water, and it becomes a really good substitute for all of the bad sodas and pops and colas out there. And especially adding lemon to it, that makes it even more healthy.
Yeah, it's so delicious. And you know, Vishen, the average person today is consuming 66 pounds of added sugar every single year. Yeah, it's insane. It's insane. That is not okay.
Now, one of the things in your book, okay, that I think is worth talking about, because you just mentioned avocados. So I woke up early this morning at 6:30 a.m. to dive into your work and start reading your book. And then I went for breakfast with the family in Greenwich Village, and I ordered avocados on toast because of how much you were raving about avocados. But it was funny. In every restaurant, and I went to another restaurant for lunch, again, avocados, they come with toast. Now, in your book, you explain a very important rule. Do not mix fatty foods with carbs. Let's go in that, because this is an important reason why you do not want to eat your avocados with toast.
Yeah, I mean, nowhere in nature are you going to find fat and starch combined, or fat and sugar combined. That combination does not exist in nature, with the exception of milk. And the purpose of milk, from an evolutionary standpoint, is to pack weight onto a newborn, right? Only modern foods combine sugar and fat, and it's that combination that they use in animal models of the standard American high-fat diet to drive obesity, to drive type 2 diabetes. It's the obesogenic standard American diet. It's the combination of fat and sugar. The body is very good at handling, you could almost argue that the body can handle a low-fat diet, and it can also handle a very low carb diet. And certainly, if you look around the world, there are populations that are consuming both kinds of diets and seemingly thriving, right? I mean, you can look at the Okinawans in Japan, which is one of the world's blue zones, and they're eating a relatively low-fat diet, right? They're not eating a high-fat paleo diet with butter on everything, right? But it's sort of like one or the other, you know? But the problem in the modern world when it comes to eating a low-fat diet is that trying to eat a low-fat diet in the modern world is like walking across a Vietnamese field in the 60s, right? You're just being set up for failure in every which way, because you're constantly being marketed low-fat products, which are usually loaded with added sugar, and the oils in those products are even unhealthier than any fat that you would naturally find in food.
So what you're saying is avoid anything with the label low fat on it.
Oh, certainly. Unless it's naturally low fat. I mean, you know, a bag of kale is going to be naturally low fat. Fat has been demonized over the past couple of decades in the United States, and the United States really set the precedent for the rest of the world in terms of telling human beings how to eat, which is something that for, you know, hundreds of thousands of years was governed by intuition, by seasonal availability, by geography. But you know, we now live in a time where advice is coming at us from every which way. And food marketing is really something that we have to contend with on a daily basis. Should we be eating low-fat foods, low-sodium foods, fat-free foods, low-cholesterol foods?
So the general rules, I believe, are anything that you see that says low-fat, avoid it.
Yeah.
Including low-fat milk.
Yes.
Because as in this Nestle example, when a company says that it's low fat, firstly they are lying to you, because what's going on is to maintain the taste, by removing the fat, they're adding a ton more sugar.
Yes.
And sugar is so much worse. And in your book, you explain the reason why. You explain the story of Ancel Keys, that evil genius who got the US government to believe the myth that fats were bad and sugars were harmless.
Right.
He was, of course, paid by the sugar lobby. And that myth stuck with the US government recommendations for what to eat for several decades before it was busted, like pretty much 20 years ago.
Yeah. You definitely want to avoid anything that says low fat, especially if it's a packaged processed food. You do not want, although you could argue that, most of the fats that are being added to packaged processed foods are very unhealthy fats too. So the way to solve all of your problems is to stay away from packaged processed foods. But certainly, if you're consuming dairy products, the research really seems to stand in favor of full-fat dairy. If I'm buying yogurt, for example, Greek yogurt, which is something that I'll eat sometimes, I'm looking on the labels and I'm looking for whole milk yogurt,
Right.
not the skim milk, because essentially skim milk, you've got skimmed off certainly the fat, but some of the most important nutrients
taken away.
in the yogurt are taken away. The fat-soluble vitamins and other nutrients.
So likewise, if you're eating yogurt, if you're eating cheese, if you are eating dairy, avoid low-fat dairy.
Absolutely, yes.
That's an important rule.
Yep.
Now, let's talk about fats, right? So again, combining fats and carbs is unhealthy. So butter is healthy, but butter on bread, not healthy. Avocados are healthy, but avocado on bread, not healthy. But there's a scientific reason why we shouldn't be combining fats and sugars. And it has to do with how our bodies metabolize
Yes.
these two substances together. Could you explain?
Yeah. So, one of the things that happens when we consume a dense source of carbohydrates is that it stimulates a hormone called insulin to be released by the pancreas. Now, insulin is not a bad hormone at all. It was a life-saving hormone for the majority of our evolution, because what it does is it causes our bodies to store fat, and this was certainly useful. Obviously, before the advent of supermarkets and food apps that bring us, all the food that our hearts can desire 24 hours a day, we didn't know where our next meal was going to come from. The problem is today insulin is chronically elevated around the clock. And other than causing our bodies to really create an environment that favors fat storage, it's also a growth hormone. And you can see very tangibly, people that have chronically elevated insulin tend to have more skin tags. Have you ever seen those unsightly things that many people have? I used to have a few of them. They're basically like these outgrowths of skin.
Right,
They're
right.
benign tumors, essentially. People that have chronically high levels of insulin tend to have more skin tags. Why is that? Well, because insulin is a growth hormone. It causes things to grow.
Wow.
Yeah. And the problem with combining sugar and fat is that you're going to get an insulin spike whenever you consume anything that has a appreciable amount of carbohydrates, whether it's sugar or a baked potato or a brown rice bowl or a quinoa bowl. Your body needs to get that glucose out of your blood, and it does so with the help of insulin. A short, quick insulin spike is great. Most of the time, especially if you're active, the insulin is going to push the sugar that was in your blood into your muscles, where the sugar is going to stay and help power you through your next workout.
Right.
The problem with adding fat into that equation is that fat potentiates the insulin release. So your pancreas is basically going to over-respond and secrete more insulin than is needed to clear a given amount of carbohydrates. And so just from an overall health perspective and wanting to keep insulin as low as we can for more time and to sort of reduce what's called the insulin area under the curve, it's wise to, when we're eating a meal, to either eat a low-carb, high-fat meal or a low-fat, high-carb meal. I would not generally advise eating low-fat, high-carb meals because, again, as we mentioned, most of the time it's going to involve processed foods, and the only real utility for a meal like that in the modern world is after a workout.
So what you're saying is focus on low-carb, high-fat.
Yes, low-carb, high-fat.
Now, the science can be very confusing. In February this year, I read that Stanford did a study to identify which was better, low-fat meals or low-carb meals, right? And they found that both created pretty much the same reduction in the test group's body weight. Now, this confuses people because
Yeah.
it seems to suggest that low-fat and low-carb are equally beneficial. What's the truth?
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you bring this up. You absolutely can lose weight if you're burning more calories than you're consuming on a low-fat, high-carb diet or a low-carb, high-fat diet. That's the math of how weight loss works. But what that equation doesn't take into account is the fact that when you're chronically eating low-fat, high-carb foods, there's a behavioral impact of those kinds of foods. Those kinds of foods stimulate hunger because what they do is they keep you on a blood sugar roller coaster throughout the day. So you can try your hardest to really use your willpower to eat a low-fat, high-carb diet, but I guarantee you that it's not going to work out in the long run, especially because modern low-fat, high-carb foods are all packaged processed foods that are horrible for you.
Right. So that study by Stanford, and I was so disappointed when I read that Stanford produced that work because that study confused so many people, and the basis of the study was false because they were not measuring the ease of being on such a diet, right? Like you
Right.
said, when you go for low fat, high carb, you're going to need a lot more willpower
Yeah.
to stay true to that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other thing that's worth mentioning is that some of our most protein-dense foods also are higher fat foods. So grass-fed beef, chicken,
Right.
things like that. These foods tend to have more fat, and we want to be eating protein-dense foods because protein is the most satiating of the macronutrients, meaning that it helps fill us up. And it also actually provides what's called a thermic effect. There's a thermic effect of feeding, and the effect is the most pronounced when we're consuming protein. So, by eating a low fat, high carb diet, I mean, that's probably excluding a lot of fatty, high protein foods.
And so
that you
what's
should
going
definitely
on
be
is you
eating.
might lose weight in the short term, but there's a long-term disadvantage that you're accumulating, right?
Yeah.
Because you're taking less protein. And the other thing is that fats are necessary for brain functioning. So if you're cutting down on fats, that's actually probably going to increase your odds of dementia
Yes.
as you get older.
Well, yeah, and you're also probably going to be victim to a whole host of unhealthy fats that are in the packaged processed foods that you're eating. It's very hard unless you're incredibly diligent to implement a healthy Okinawan style
Right.
low fat diet in the modern world. It's much easier, and I think it helps benefit our willpower and our adherence to weight loss diets when consuming a low carb diet. It also helps your body regain metabolic flexibility, and keep your hunger levels low, energy levels stable, and things like that.
So the secret then is low carb, high fat.
Yes.
Okay, now in your book, you go deep into fats, right? And you mentioned a couple of things which are interesting. One of the things you said that really caught my attention is reduce added saturated fats like butter and ghee.
Yes.
But what about what Dave Asprey is saying
Yeah.
about adding butter and ghee to your coffee?
Well, you know what
Or
it comes.
bulletproof coffee.
Yeah, what it comes down to is that everybody's different. Some people certainly thrive when adding more butter to their diets, and others don't. This is not a one-size-fits-all dietary approach. Some people over-respond to the presence of saturated fats in the diet, and the food that's going to have the highest proportion of saturated fats as a percentage of its fat content is going to be dairy. So, when writing a book, you have to write the book that's going to benefit the most, do the most good for the greatest number of people. And I'm always very quick to make to point out that everybody's different. Some people might absolutely thrive by putting butter in their smoothies and putting it on everything that they're eating. But some people with certain genes might actually respond in a negative way to added saturated fats. So to make it really easy for you and for everybody that reads my work and finds my work, I say it's totally okay to consume saturated fat when it's present in whole foods like grass-fed beef, even extra virgin olive oil, which is the hallmark of the Mediterranean diet, which is associated with reduced risk for neurological disease, cardiovascular disease. Extra virgin olive oil is 14 to 15% saturated fat. So saturated fat is not bad, but for most people, I would say it's probably wise to limit it to the whole foods in which it's naturally found.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. So olive oil, great.
Yes.
Fatty meats, great.
Yes.
Too much fats in butter or ghee for certain people might not be good.
Yes.
So you want to make sure that you know what you're doing before you add ghee or butter to your coffee.
Yeah, and the best way to do that is to have regular checkups with your doctor, get a sense of your lipids, so your triglycerides, cholesterol, things like that. I go into a very nuanced explanation of how cholesterol works in the book, but essentially, if you have a very exaggerated response to your blood lipids after you start adding a lot more butter to your diet, then I'm not going to say that that's necessarily a bad thing because we don't yet know, but I do think it's wise when it comes to your health and for all of these unexplored questions like nutrigenomics, how an excessive amount of saturated fat is going to affect certain people with a certain genetic background. I think it's wise to hedge your bets a little bit. And so that's why in the book I make the recommendation that if you enjoy butter in your coffee, a little butter in your coffee is not going to hurt you.
Right.
But I think that the overzealotry for adding more saturated fats to the diet, I think doesn't really serve everybody. And so I urge a little bit of caution.
Okay, now let's go into another really interesting part of your book, which is omega-6 versus omega-3s.
Yes.
So first tell us, for those of us who haven't gone deep into nutrition, what's the difference between omega-6 and omega-3, and what is it that you recommend?
So both omega-3s and omega-6s are essential fatty acids. We need to get both from our diets, but today we're over-consuming omega-6s by an order of magnitude beyond omega-3s. And the ratio that we likely consume them for the majority of our evolution is somewhere between 1:1 to 1:4 omega-3s to omega-6s. The problem with the fact that we're over-consuming omega-6s is that omega-6s provide the raw materials to our body's inflammation pathways. And the thinking behind that is that they basically cause us to be in a perpetual state of chronic low-grade inflammation. The other problem is that these omega-6 fats tend to be most concentrated in unhealthy oils like grain and seed oils, like canola oil, corn oil, grapeseed oil. And so these oils are not only providing an excessive amount of the raw materials to our body's inflammatory response, but they're also stimulating our body's inflammatory response because these oils they tend to be oxidized. Again, damaged, it's a form of chemical damage by the time we consume them. So they're bad news all around when it comes to health. But where omega-3s come in, omega-3s are really important because they promote a characteristic of your brain cell membranes called membrane fluidity. So when it comes to your neurotransmitters working the way that they ought to, we're talking about serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine. These are neurotransmitters involved in how we navigate the world. Our feelings of reward, happiness, having optimal executive function, learning, memory, focus, attention. These are all functions of our cognition that are reliant on the healthy workings of neurotransmitters. And their ability to do their jobs properly all may come down to brain cell membranes, and the brain cell membranes themselves possessing a property called fluidity. And omega-3s basically promote membrane fluidity, whereas omega-6 fats tend to promote a more rigid neuronal membrane. And the worst offender of all of them are trans fats, which basically promote very stiff brain cell membranes.
Now, what are some of the foods where you can find omega-3s versus omega-6s?
So omega-3s are going to be most readily found in the fat of fatty fish like mackerel, sardines, wild salmon. For people out there that enjoy herring, taratuyu, herring, is rich in omega-3s. They're also found in appreciable amounts in the yolks of omega-3 enriched eggs or pastured eggs, and also grass-fed beef.
And omega-6?
Omega-6s are predominantly going to be found in the fat of grain-fed beef, of farmed salmon, and of oils like canola oil, corn oil, and soybean oil. So,
got it. So it's omega-6 that we want to maybe cut down on.
Yeah, we definitely want to limit our intake of omega-6 fats.
Okay,
and perhaps increase our intake of omega-3 fats.
Now, there's a couple of other things that you mentioned in the book, which I found fascinating. One is fasting. You mentioned that intermittent fasting, which is and the formula you give is the 16-8 formula. That means putting your eating in an 8-hour span, which is actually quite easy, and then fasting for 16 hours.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
Well, essentially what it does is it allows your digestive system to take a break. It allows you to spend more time in a low insulin state. So we were talking earlier a little bit about insulin and the fact that it's one of the body's major growth hormones. When insulin is elevated, your body is in an anabolic state. Your body has been elegantly adapted to carry out different custodial functions, both in an anabolic state and its inverse, a catabolic state. And today I think few would argue that we're spending a little too much time in that anabolic state because we're constantly eating around the clock. Insulin is chronically elevated, right? So I think the value of intermittent fasting, it's multifaceted, to be sure, but I think one of the top benefits come from the fact that you're basically allowing your body to spend more time in a low insulin state, thereby allowing those custodial functions to really occur that are meant to happen in that catabolic state. One of them is a process called autophagy, which is essentially your body's and cells' waste disposal mechanisms. They've done animal studies where they've genetically altered mice to have an accelerated rate of autophagy, and they found that it actually increases their life and health spans. So autophagy is and optimizing autophagy is really important when it comes to having a healthy, long life.
And autophagy, I think you defined it in your book as when your body is metabolizing broken proteins.
Yes.
Right?
Correct.
Like protein waste from your musculature and
Yeah,
so on.
yeah, and organelles that have become damaged. So mitochondria is the center of metabolism, which is what gives us the energy to think and to move about the world. It's really probably one of the most important aspects of being alive is.
So you're saying this happens when we put ourselves through a 16-hour fast.
Yes.
Now, what about 12 hours? The reason I ask is because, and you guys may have noticed this, we have an episode on intermittent fasting with Dr. Oz Garcia, who's also based here in New York. Now, Oz suggests that 12 to 16 hours is sort of the sweet spot. Is there a better benefit to going 16 hours, or is 12 hours of intermittent fasting enough?
You know, it really comes down to the individual and what the individual is most comfortable with. It is a stressor on the body. So if you have chronic stress, you want to be careful. You want to really kind of tap in and make sure that it's not sort of compounding the effect of your chronic stress. Women might benefit from a shorter fast. You know, they have hormonal systems that are more attuned to signals of food scarcity. But generally speaking, I don't really obsess over the hours. What I simply like to do is not eat for an hour or 2 or 3 after I wake up, and to not eat for 2 to 3 hours before bed. That to me is a nice sort of, it frees me from numbers, which, the body doesn't think in terms of numbers. It thinks in terms of its like circadian inclinations.
I learned intermittent fasting from our mutual friend, Ben Greenfield. We were hanging out in Europe for like 2 weeks straight, and we'd go out to these incredible restaurants in Tallinn and eat this amazing food. We were there with his kids and my kids, and we would stop at 9 p.m. And then I would not eat again. So I would skip breakfast. Every time I went out with Ben, I would skip breakfast the next day and then have lunch at 1 p.m. That was a 16-hour fast. And that's basically it. So it's as simple as skipping breakfast. Now, Ben explained one thing to me, because I really started intermittent fasting when I was hanging out with him. And he said, look, the first time you do this, you're going to be afraid that you're going to suffer from hunger. You're going to think that skipping breakfast is going to make you feel uncomfortable at work, and you may not be able to focus. But know that your body's going to adjust really, really, really rapidly. There's going to be a hormone called ghrelin, which is going to be produced when you're hungry. And it's going to spike, but very rapidly. If you just resist the food, it's going to dip. And that hunger is going to disappear. And sure enough, I was hungry for like 15 minutes. And then the second and the third time I did it, the hunger wasn't even an issue. So it's only difficult for about less than an hour the first time you do it. Would you say that's generally true?
I would say that's true. And it becomes easier the fewer carbohydrates that you generally
That's
eat
true.
over the course of the day. And so that's actually one of the other benefits of eating a low-carb, high-fat diet, is that it becomes easier to intermittent fast.
So if you're meditating, because intermittent fasting is a stressor, so you want to make sure your life is generally stress-free, so meditation helps. Low-carb diet helps. So really what you're getting here is a stacking effect. If you're meditating, if you're already on a low-carb diet, you can now make intermittent fasting easier for you. And so you're just putting your body into an extremely healthy state.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's basically the protocol. That's how I live my life. I wish I was a more diligent meditator, but I have other ways of diffusing stress. I think, meditation is so important, right? But I also think that it's okay to not meditate if you have other ways of diffusing stress.
If you have other ways of diffusing stress,
don't feel guilty about not meditating, because that'll stress you out even further.
Right. So the reason we're talking about stresses is because in this book, Max talks about hormesis, right? And hormesis is the act of putting your body under a certain amount of stress. For example, Ben Greenfield talks about hormesis in the form of hot-cold showering as a way to boost metabolic efficiency. Now, intermittent fasting is a form of hormesis. It's a stressor on the body, but it can be difficult if you're already going through a lot of, say, work stress, because it's just added stress. So therefore, if you are leading a fairly healthy, less stressful life, if you are on a low-carb diet, intermittent fasting becomes so much easier.
Absolutely, yeah. And hormesis is really, it's life, It's like life begins at the end of your comfort zone. We say this, we post it on our Instagram accounts, but it's true particularly as it pertains to biology and really bringing about our most robust selves. When we're going to the gym, we are basically using exercise as a hormetic stressor to bring about positive change in our physiques, in our strength, and things like that. When you're taking a cold shower, it's the same thing. It's getting out of your body's comfort zone, and your body responds in a very beneficial way. Some of the most valuable phytochemicals found in plants are beneficial to us because at the very tiny micro level, at the cellular level, they're actually stressful to cells. Whether it's our own cells or the microbes that live in our large intestine, that's how these foods benefit us. And what happens is we respond in a very positive way, ultimately causing us to become more robust and resilient. Actually, there's a wonderful effect that occurs that's been coined cross-adaptation. So when talking about stress, how amazing is it that you can put your body through about a physical stress and then reap sort of a dividend when it comes to your psychological stress? That wouldn't make sense, right? It's not like you were sitting in therapy. You were in the gym lifting weights or taking a cold shower. But this cross-adaptive effect is really interesting because what it suggests is that we can actually become psychologically more resilient by becoming physically more resilient.
Wow. So what this means is that if you're doing certain forms of exercise that make you more physically resilient, you also become psychologically resilient. Your brain functioning improves.
Yeah.
That's really, really, really important to remember. Now, there's so many other concepts that I'd love to go deep with you. But again, for those of you who are watching, remember, one of the biggest changes you can make almost immediately is to understand how food companies and how the media blatantly lies to us, and to focus on those 10 foods that Max mentioned, those 10 foods. That's one of the most important things you're learning today. Focus on those 10 foods. Now, Max, really quickly, there are a couple of other things you mentioned in your book that I want to quickly touch on. And guys, seriously, if you feel we're going too fast, you want to go deeper, get the book Genius Foods. So you talk about sleep, right? You do mention in your book that if you cut back on your sleep, if you aren't sleeping enough, you're naturally going to see day-to-day hunger go up. The hunger hormone, ghrelin, is produced. So sleep has a huge impact on our decisions of what to eat.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the master regulator of our body's hormones, which, we like to think that we have free will, but at the end of the day, we're biological puppets that are controlled in many ways by our hormones and by the signals that we're giving our stomachs, and there's a myriad of inputs, but at the end of the day, research has shown that with just one night of poor sleep, not only hormonally are you less able to process glucose, which is problematic because sugar, once it's in the body, it's not inert. It actually can damage tissues and our vasculature. But it actually also increases our cravings. I like to say that when you're underslept, the reptile brain becomes more active. So, we tend to, when we're well slept, we're at our most creative. We're truly at our most human when we're well slept. But when we're underslept, we go into survival mode. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we're functioning only at the base level of the pyramid. And usually what that does is it causes us to crave easily digestible sources of carbohydrates and sugar, and foods that combine fat and sugar, because those really are what we need when we're in that survival mode.
And so science shows that skipping out on a good night's sleep doesn't just reduce your cognitive functioning and make you a weaker performer at work. It makes you make dumber choices about food.
Oh yeah, it can. Especially for people that are trying to lose weight, if you're trying to drop the spare tire, sleep is probably the first place that I would say to go and optimize your life, because
sleep is number one.
Sleep is number one. Yeah, I mean, it sounds so weird.
It does, right?
But it's true that dietary change for most people is among the hardest things to do, and it becomes infinitely harder if you're not sleeping well.
And in the book you mentioned the chemical shifts that happen when we deprive ourselves of good sleep, and how that relates to hunger and food and our decisions. So there's a lot of science behind that. Now, one more thing real quick. Microbiomes. What do we need to know about our gut microbiome?
Well, essentially that you have a second brain, and it's the universe of microorganisms that live in your large intestine. We are just at the very tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding the role that they play in our health and our thinking moment to moment, but we do know that they play a role. And aside from that, one of I think the most actionable things that we can take away, even at this juncture, it's very early for microbiome research, but what we do know is that the body's immune system is closely attuned to what's going on in the large intestine, which is where these microorganisms sort of hang out, because they're foreign bodies and they communicate very closely with our immune cells. And so inflammation is one of the cornerstones of modern chronic diseases: obesity, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, autoimmune conditions like multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes. There's a definite connection between all of these conditions and what's going on in the microbiome. And one of the best ways that we know, even at this early stage, to really nurture the microbiome is by consuming a diverse array of plant matter. And the plants that I advise consuming in Genius Foods really are the plants that are going to nurture those bacteria.
So that top 10 list actually has huge impact on your gut.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, it's not that the grass-fed beef is going to help your gut. It's not that the eggs are going to help your gut. Although omega-3s actually have been shown to independently affect gut health. So in a sense, actually, they might. But it's really the dark leafy greens, it's the cruciferous vegetables, it's the berries, it's all these plant compounds. We talked about some of the hormetic effect of some of them, but it's also plant fiber.
So spinach and kale is not just good for, it's really stuff that's incredible for your gut.
Well, it feeds you, but it also feeds the commensal bacteria that live in your large intestine. Commensal literally means to share a table. So we're sharing a table with these microorganisms every time we sit down to eat.
Yeah, so get this, guys. Roughly 3 to 4% of your body weight is your bacteria in your body, across your body. And the average human being today, we know, has more non-human cells in the form of bacteria than we do human cells. And so this is something that science is just getting into. And I believe that there's going to be a huge explosion in research on this. But what Max is sharing is what we know today about how our guts function.
Oh yeah, it's mind-blowing. We have bacteria all over our skin. We have it in our genitals. Parts of our bodies once thought to be completely sterile. We now know that there are huge swaths of bacteria, like the mammary glands of the breasts. Mm-hmm. They just discovered that people with pancreatic cancer, the number of bacteria in the pancreas shoots up 1,000-fold, which is, we don't yet know what to make of that information, right? But it's very interesting because pancreatic cancer is one of these things that there's no treatment for. It's one of the most deadly forms of cancer that there is. So, the coming years are certainly going to bring a lot of new insights when it comes to these sorts of things. But in the interim, we do have enough information where we don't have to sit on our hands and wait idly until science continues to clarify. Right. We know that people that eat lots of dietary fiber in the form of plants, tend to have better health spans, longer lives, less inflammation. They have more butyrate, measurable in blood and in stool. That is a sign that these bacteria are churning out these beneficial chemicals. And so, we also know that in the Western world, where we're seeing skyrocketing rates of autoimmune conditions like type 1 diabetes, that we place the microbiome as an afterthought with, an over-reliance on antibiotics, which are overprescribed. An over-obsession with sterility and hygiene, all those things like that.
Right.
We've got
and that over-obsession is actually bad for you because this bacteria has evolved to actually nurture our body.
Yes.
A lot of these, like we live in symbiosis with these bacteria.
Exactly. Well said.
Now, one more thing before we wrap up. This is a question that I know people are going to ask, okay? You mentioned that 60% of our modern diet is coming from corn, rice, and wheat. And you said you ideally do not suggest we don't take much of this in our body. But there is a portion of your book where you do mention that around 20 to 40 grams a day of carbs is okay. Could you clarify?
Yeah. Everybody's going to have a different carbohydrate tolerance. So I'm not a zealot. I'm not a low carb. I'm not waging a jihad against carbohydrates. Right. But people have different activity levels, different fitness levels, different amounts of muscle on their bodies, and so different people are going to tolerate a different number of carbohydrates. We can look to the world's blue zones where they're eating tons of carbohydrates, and they're seemingly thriving, but they're also very active, and they don't have to schedule their workouts the way that we do here in the Western world. So for your average person, I would say, it's probably a good idea when you're beginning the diet that I set forth in Genius Foods to really begin with a very low carb break-in period. to get your body into a sort of ketogenic state, and then to begin to, it's sort of like a carbohydrate elimination diet. And then to begin to reintegrate them as needed and in accordance with your physical activity levels.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Max. So, guys, we went so deep in this. I know some of you might want to explore food and nutrition deeper. So, here are the episodes I recommend you watch following this. Number 1, check out Oz Garcia on intermittent fasting. And number 2, remember, as Max said, sleep. Sleep is one of the first things you can do to start putting your body in a healthy state. And I just did a podcast episode with America's sleep doctor, Dr. Michael Bruce. You'll find it on the Mind Valley podcast. It became our number 1 most downloaded episode.
Wow.
Incredible stuff there. 35 minutes. Michael Bruce is going to show you how to optimize your sleep. So check those out. Don't forget to buy Genius Foods. As I said, I'm loving this book. You can tell I went deep into it because I had so many questions for Max. It's an incredible book, and I think reading this book could be one of the best investments you make in yourself this month because of how it's going to get you to be so conscious about what you feed yourself and your family. Your kids, your children, your future children are going to thank you for this. And especially your brain is so going to appreciate this. Max, thank you so much.
Thank you, Vishen. It was a real treat.
Any closing words?
Oh, man, I just think it's like, again, we take trips, we go to museums to gawk at artifacts of time past, right? But all we need to do is look in the mirror and acknowledge the fact that each one of us carries this incredible legacy with us. And yet, for so many people that are struggling with mental health problems, with brains that are not working the way that they ought to, I really think that that's a shame. And that's just for people when they're young and seemingly healthy. But, I see dementia every single day. I see it in my mom, and it's one of the worst things that I can imagine happening to a person. And so, any step that you can do to minimize your risk, I think it's worth taking those steps. And, no matter how old you are watching this, whether you're in your 20s or you're in your 70s, you're never too young or too old to start living the Genius lifestyle and to really, for once in the modern world, start to stack the odds in your favor, which I think is important.
Amazing. Thank you, Max.
Thanks, Vishen.
Thank you guys for tuning in.